Have you ever felt like you had to prove to everyone that you're a complete idiot? Yeah, me neither. But 2 years ago, I was about to graduate as an engineer. And in school you learn all about these theoretical things that no one really cares about and that you never end up using anyways. So I thought it would be a great idea to build something, like some kind of robot, to really showcase my engineering skills. And also prove to everyone that I'm not a complete idiot. But instead of making something reasonable, like, I don't know, a robot arm or something, I decided to spend 8 months making a tank. Yeah, I don't know why either, but it turned out great. It's a complete disaster. But the worst part is that I bought this tank chassis for way too much money, because I thought it would make it easier since it already had tracks with suspension and everything. But no, it turns out that it's complete garbage. You see, real tanks have something called a track tensioner, which basically makes sure that the tracks stay on the tank when it drives. Because when it drives over things, or you add weight to it, the suspension is compressed and the tracks become loose. This can cause the tracks to fall off. The track tensioner prevents this by also applying pressure to the tracks. And this thing doesn't have a track tensioner, so the tracks randomly fall off sometimes. Oh, and one of the gearboxes broke, so you can't even drive straight anymore. Which isn't exactly gonna help me prove how good I am at building things. So the reasonable thing would be to fix this one and move on to something else. But me being a fucking idiot, I decided to make another one. Completely from scratch. The main problem with the last one was that it barely worked at all. But let's start with the suspension. The only problem is that I have no idea how a tank suspension actually works, which is why I bought the old chassis in the first place. However, while doing some research, I stumbled upon this guy, who actually seemed to know what he was doing. And he had already made a working tank suspension. Our tank suspension. Wait, we can't make that joke anymore. After borrowing Miranda's design, we have something that looks like this. Next up we have the chassis, which is divided into 6 pieces that are glued together, because the entire thing is massive and my 3D printer isn't big enough to print the whole tank in one piece. The suspension is then mounted directly to the chassis like this, and it even has a fully functioning track tensioner, so the tracks won't randomly fall off. I know, I'm a genius. The tracks are just a bunch of these links put together, with a piece of filament holding it in place, and I also glued some small plates on each link to give it some extra traction, so it was really easy to make. Except that it took like 2 weeks to print everything, and there are 89 links in each track, so I had to do all of that 178 times, which took forever. And just like that, we have a working suspension for the tank. Who would have thought that this design that I came up with completely by myself would actually work, huh? Anyways, we need some type of motor to drive the tank, because I'm not going to push the thing around. Brushless motors like these are pretty common nowadays, and they're very powerful, so they would have been a great choice for this. But then I realized that I spin at like 20,000 RPM, and we don't want the tank to go at Mach 10, so we need to build some type of gearbox to slow them down a bit. But that's a lot of work, so instead, I just bought a couple of these DC motors that are way less powerful, because we already had a built-in gearbox, so I didn't have to make my own. So I added 2 of those on each side, because I have no idea how much power this thing needs, so we're just gonna hope for the best. And it actually works. But right now I've just connected everything directly to a power supply, but we obviously want to be able to drive it around without any cables attached. And the logical solution to that would be to add a simple motor controller and connect that to an RC receiver, so you can drive it like a normal RC car. Or at least that's what a smart person would have done. But I'm not very smart, so instead added a bunch of unnecessary electronics that looks like a goddamn bird's nest and connected everything to Arduino. It's honestly a miracle this thing even works at all. Oh, and I also made this fully custom controller with a screen and everything for no reason. I could have just bought a controller on Amazon and not wasted like 3 weeks, but I'll come back to that later. Then I added some covers for the tracks and gave it this kinda urban looking camo that doesn't stand out too much, and I actually think it turned out really good. So now we have a tank that can drive around on its own, and it looks pretty cool. So we're more or less done. Except that we're missing the most important thing of all, so I spent another 3 weeks making this. But we need a way to mount the turret to the tank, because right now there's just a giant hole, and that's not going to work. And all we need to do is remove the lid, add another motor controller, 2 motors, a slip ring so everything can rotate, that's gonna hold a couple of gears, that, put the lid back way too many another screws, thing, and slap the turret on there. And just like that, we have a working turret on the tank. Like I mentioned earlier, I made this custom controller to drive the tank. Don't worry, I won't bore you too much with the details, but it works very similar to a normal RC controller. It sends the data from the joysticks and buttons and so on to the tank like any controller, but it can also receive information from the tank. For example, the tank automatically detects what type of turret it's using and sends this information to the controller, which is then displayed like this. You know, just in case you're blind and can't see what's standing right in front of you, but it can also display how much battery is left and so on, which is really cool. And if all of that wasn't enough, I also made the entire thing waterproof. Not for any real reason. I'm not exactly gonna drive this thing to a lake. So I put it in the shower instead, to prove to that it is in fact waterproof. And it is, just in the worst possible way. it turns out that the sealer on the turret was not doing a very good job sealing, and it also turns out that the bottom of the tank is very waterproof, so water just leaks in from the top via the turret and gets stuck inside the tank, which is arguably worse than not being waterproof at all. But it did still work despite being filled with water, so it's still technically waterproof. But let's forget about that. Here's some footage from before I decided to drench everything in the shower. As you can see, everything is working flawlessly. It's probably just a one-off thing that we can ignore. The new suspension is great.
As you can see, it's working as intended.
Okay, this isn't exactly the greatest tank of all time, but it took me a long time to build and it looks really cool, so give me a break. Regardless, it's really fun to drive.